Hi, everybody. I'm Joe Lample, the Joe behind Joe Gardener, and welcome to the Joe Gardener Show. Today's episode is an encore, and like every episode we post, they are all worthy of a second listen or watch, and this is the first time it's being posted as a YouTube video, so I think you will enjoy this even more. At the time we originally set up this podcast interview with today's guest, Dr. Kaitlin Stack Whitney, it was intended to be around an article that she authored regarding the practice and concerns of using wild harvested and widely distributed ladybugs, specifically convergent ladybirds as they're commonly known, taken from sites in and around the Sierra Nevada mountains around California. They're then stored and shipped to retailers and to home gardeners across the country who buy and use them as a form of natural and biological pest control against primarily aphids and other soft-bodied insect pests. But without a full understanding of the unintended consequences of this natural pest control strategy, the idea seems fairly benign, but it's not. And that's what I wanted to talk to Kaitlyn about today. But the added benefit of this conversation today goes much deeper than just the concerns of transporting and using non-local ladybugs, especially when there are many resident ladybugs wherever we live. Kaitlyn is an environmental studies scholar and assistant professor in the Science, Technology, and Society Department at the Rochester Institute of Technology, College and Liberal Arts. And here's the bonus. She's also an active home vegetable gardener and a very experienced community gardener, even serving as president of her community gardening association when she lived near Washington, D.C. So what you're going to hear today is rich, deep, and very thought-provoking. I hope you enjoy it, and I'll see you on the other side. Dr. Stack Whitney, thank you very much for being here today. You know, and looking at your bio and the fact that you're a real home gardener and you're very involved in your community garden and you're a master composter, that got my attention. And I know that's getting the attention right now from our listeners as they hear that. So we have a lot to talk about today. I have a lot of questions and your background is so interesting. So welcome and thank you for being here.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
All right. So here's how I always start this. Let's hear in your words how you would like for us to learn more about you. Just tell us a little bit about how you came to the studies that you pursued and the fact, your gardening life. Tell us about that too.
Sure. Well, so I'm Caitlyn and I'm an environmental studies professor. And so I think that one way to think about that is that my background is looking at the environment, but also making sure that we're looking at ways of understanding and exploring the environment that's beyond the sciences. So in terms of how I got into gardening myself, I grew up in a suburban area and my family had a beautiful ornamental garden. We didn't grow up growing anything that we would eat. So I certainly always aesthetically appreciated it. But I became really interested in agricultural topics and actually decided that's what I wanted to go to college to learn more about. And so when I went off to college, I was really interested in learning more about growing food, about understanding how policy affected like international food issues. And because I didn't have a lot of that experience, and I certainly wasn't from a farm or anything, I started working on a farm that was at my college. I started getting more experience and had a community garden plot with friends and started really trying to get more of that hands-on experience and, trials and tribulations of learning what this was like to really kind of connect those things that you're reading about and learning about in more of an abstract way. With trying to do it myself and get that appreciation, and do things like actually eat a tomato that you've grown yourself and have that experience of it being so different. So that's certainly where it started for me and really appreciated the communal aspects of being, for example, a community garden. So ever since in the places that I've lived, it's been a pleasure to try to find where there are community gardens and have plots there. And part of that is super practical, right? Like living in apartments and things where there's not always space to have a garden of one's own. Now, as someone who has a space that's not always moving around, we turned our front lawn, into a vegetable garden. And so now instead of having a grass lawn, we are growing mostly vegetables, but also things that are just for fun or for the birds. So for example, we have some sunflowers now that are about 10 feet tall, and they are mostly just feeding the birds in our yard, right? And so it's an absolute pleasure to be able to look out the window and know that even though that's not for us, that's actually, there's so much life that's there. We are growing a kind of scarlet runner bean this summer that we noticed that hummingbirds are visiting, right? So there's
Yeah.
so much joy, I think,
Yeah.
that comes from having a garden, even if you're not eating everything out of it.
So now you're in the Rochester, New York area, right?
Yep. So I live in
Yeah.
the Rochester, New York region. Yep. And so it's interesting. It's a different growing zone than one I grew up in. And I think, as many of us are probably experiencing, seasons are changing a lot year to year. And it makes a lot of challenges, but also every day and every season is new. And I think that's the glass
Yeah.
way to look at that. So for example, here this summer, it's been very, very wet, really, really wet, and
Hmm.
actually much cooler. And so I would say that some of the things that normally are looking for like hot, dry weather are not doing great this summer. But meanwhile, some other plants that we don't normally have do very well this long
Yeah.
are thriving this year. So, it's I'm sure everyone listening knows, right? It's always something. You're dealing with
Yeah.
something new every season.
I think that's part of what we love about gardening is that no 2 years, let alone seasons or days are the same, you know? So there's always that new adventure the next day or that next season. And, for what it's worth, even in spite of climate change, it keeps us on our toes, and it's very humbling because, we're always adapting to what Mother Nature's throwing at us. And going back to what you said a minute ago, you converted your front yard to an edible food garden or just for fun stuff. So is it safe to say you don't live in an HOA?
It is safe to say that. We did look up, what are the
Yeah.
rules about this around here? Yes, we don't. I know many people do, and there are restrictions on that. We did try to consider aesthetics though, right? And I know there's
Uh-huh.
some other people in our broader neighborhood on different blocks that also grow vegetables in their front yard. And I think that even though there's nothing formally preventing them, I think they're very trying to remember that people have lots of different ideas. Again,
Yeah.
we just started talking about that. Ideas about plants and insects are really ideas about people and what we want to do, what other people think we
Mhm.
should be doing. And so I think that it also becomes a good conversation starter for
Mhm.
people just walking their dog down the street. Some people are
Yeah.
really interested and thrilled. And I would say that actually, once we started growing that garden, in part because it is in our front yard and we live in an urban area that people are walking around, you meet people in a way that we wouldn't actually otherwise. So
Yes.
it has lots of byproducts coming just from the garden being in a place that people may not expect it.
Yeah, no kidding. But it's just fortunate that you were able to have your vegetable garden in your front yard to promote and foster that conversation with people walking by. Typically, I think in suburbia, you get the people walking their dogs and taking their walks, but more often than not, it seems like it's just a neighborly wave as they're going by, but there's not the conversation. But with the curiosity of the garden for those that aren't gardeners or they're wondering if they could do the same thing, suddenly you're in conversation with these people that you've never spoken with before, and hopefully they become friends, and maybe you've lit the spark that becomes, future gardeners for them. And I know that was big with COVID when everybody was outside and people were gardening a lot more, and many in their front yards. And that was a big thing. And you, as a community gardener for so long and being so active with that, and you already mentioned you love the communal aspect of that. And I think for those of us who are gardening in our backyards, kind of solo, or maybe with just our partner, we don't necessarily have that opportunity anymore. So there's some real upsides to either having your garden in your front yard or being involved in the community garden for sure. So I don't want to lose sight of that for those who feel like they're missing out because, they don't have a community garden or they're just in their backyard. There's great opportunities for some of the best parts of gardening, and that is the community aspect of
Oh,
it.
absolutely. And some of the neat ones that happened in Rochester is even people doing like seedling or seed exchanges. The libraries here, we have a
Yeah.
community library system here. Many of the branches here just started doing seed libraries, right? And so that's been a way to really build community that you don't need to have a yard. You don't even need to be someone who's doing seed saving. You can just benefit from
Mm,
going and checking out seeds from the library. And then the idea is that hopefully you'll save some seeds from your harvest that year and donate them back, right? But it's
yeah.
really on your honor. So that's
Yeah.
brand new in this area. I know a lot of places have had them for much longer, but it's been
Yeah.
so exciting to see that grow, especially through COVID.
Yeah.
There are other groups too that have done kind of let's everyone try to take a clipping and meet up in a space like We have a couple of different, community spaces where people will just have an event and say, get together with other people who like plants and
Uh,
just exchange them. The cooperative extension in this county actually does a plant sale every year to benefit the Master Gardener program.
mm,
And here, the way they do that is they have a bunch of people in the Master Gardener program make clippings of plants of their own or grow
yeah,
seedlings of their own. And so it's a really
yes.
nice way to make acquiring plants, both ornamental and vegetable or indoor plants,
Hmm.
more affordable for more
Yeah.
people and also raise money to help spread more information about gardening. So those are things that are really about building that community in the broader area, that there are lots of ways to kind of get involved if there are things like that near you that don't require, happening to walk by or needing to know someone already.
Yeah. I love this conversation already, to use that same word. And it's not even really the topic we're going to focus on
Yeah.
today, but that's okay. That's how gardeners are. They just get into their groove, and next thing you know, they're just talking about all kinds of things because we love that conversation. But before we do get into the main part of it, let's talk just briefly. As I mentioned, you're a master composter as well. So tell us a little bit about that program, and I assume you've got a love for compost too.
Yeah. Well, and I think, again, as someone who, when I first moved away from home, was trying to learn more about these topics really hands on, I know when I was growing up, I became really interested in composting as a way of thinking about recycling. And I remember building a bin out of pallets, in my backyard and trying to convince my family to get on board with it. One of the things that was so neat about this, and it is a really unique program I have to give a shout out to, that's the Tompkins County, New York Cooperative Extension. It's their program. Not every county in New
Right.
York has one of these right now. I know there are a few in different parts of the country, but it's similar to Master Gardener, but it's focused on compost. And one of the things that was so exciting about living in that county was that the way that they are dealing with trash is really different than where I grew up and was from. So
Mm,
where I grew up, you sort of put your trash out and you put your recycling out and you kind of don't think about it again. And in Tompkins County, they have a program where you're more actively having to think about how much trash you're generating because they pay for trash tags. So basically, when you want to put out your garbage for pickup, you have to already have prepaid for each bin. So instead of it
wow.
being kind of just built into your taxes as a flat rate, this is a way to incentivize having less trash, to make people
Ah,
think much more actively about what can be recycled, what can be reused in other ways. And so it's really part of a very progressive program in their county
mm,
to think about reducing what's going to the landfill. And so having compost education is really one part of
mm,
that, right? So they also have a really fascinating reuse directory to think about what are all the things that you might be thinking you need to throw in the trash, but actually it could be recycled in this way, or it could be sent to this other place so that it's not just going to sit in a landfill. And so really their compost education program is just part of that initiative. It's really to get people to think about, yes, you do have to pay for trash pickup, but you don't have to pay for recycling. And if we can help you find a way to deal with, for example, your yard scraps or organic waste, you
yeah.
can do that in a way that's not going to send it to the landfill, that also might be easier on your pocket. So I think that there are lots more communities thinking in that
Mm,
direction now. But yeah, I had the privilege to go through that program back in, I think, 2004, 2005 at this point.
wow.
So there are lots more communities, right, that are thinking about this now. And, I'm sitting here in New York State. We've had some big legislation come through here in the past couple of years that is really trying to change what large institutions are doing. So we had this landmark legislation that passed a few years ago that requires that institutions like grocery stores or restaurants that are generating, I think it's 2 tons or more a week
Hmm.
of food waste, have to basically either compost it, send it to a digester, start donating, right? So there are big changes happening, but they started
Wow.
with the biggest ones as sort in terms of mandates. But
Mm.
programs like Master Composter are not mandates. They're just trying to help people find what might work for them. And then, of course, if you're a gardener, there's even more reasons to be excited about compost. So I think it's always an interesting challenge. So after I was living in Tompkins County, I was living in Washington, D.C., trying to
Yeah.
keep my compost going, right? And that was a much more urban environment. And
Yeah.
then it's having to think about things like, okay, there's a lot more rats here. How can I try to have a compost pile, but also not just be feeding pests that I may not want to be feeding, right? Or things that might be a health concern to me and my neighbors. And so it was really interesting then to think about how can this continue here? How can we think about how our community garden wants to, compost? And so some of that is just about learning about the different options or containers, and then having a lot of grace with yourself and everyone else to try things, maybe
Yeah.
change things. Yeah.
Yeah, we could all use a little more grace. But Caitlin, I do want to go back to that because I know there are people right now that just heard you. They can relate to the fact that you were composting, but you were dealing with rats too. And they're wondering, what did you do to deal with that issue? So on behalf of them right now, I'm asking you, what did you do to deal with that issue?
Some of it, like I have to say, as someone who really wants to be all about free cycling and reusing materials and like building pallet bins, I have to say, like some of it, and this was true in Rochester too, when we moved here, was trying to use things like chicken wire to try to keep a wooden bin outside that was still on the ground. And we found where we were that was not effective, that they could just chew right through it. It wasn't
Yeah.
working. And we've ended up going with bins that are off the ground tumblers,
Yeah.
and actually been impressed that nothing has chewed through them or attempted to. So I think part of that too is being a little more flexible with ourselves about, we had this idea about how we really wanted to compost, and it didn't work in a way that was working for us and our neighbors in
Yeah.
practice. And so part of living right in an urban area, I think, is
Yeah.
compromise, right? And
Yeah.
recognizing that we live around a lot of other people. And so, it's a really different set of decision points than we have, extended family that lives in much more rural areas. And they're like, oh, I just sort of throw it on that side of the yard. I'm like, that works where you are. Right. And so I
Yeah.
think one of the great things about, again, like programs like Master Composter that are trying to help people find what's going to work for them and not prescribe any one option, but also just try to point out, if price point's an issue, here's where you can get things that are going to be reused materials or pre-built, or what are the different things that might be important to you as you're thinking about this. And so again, I think for us, for example, right now, it was more important to find a way to not put the food scraps in the landfill than it was to say, we had an idea of this bin system we really wanted to keep using, but
Yeah.
we didn't want to be feeding rats. And so we ended
Right.
up going with a different kind of bin than we originally
Yeah.
imagined. Yeah.
Yeah. So adapting and figuring it out as you go, and you did. So good for you. All right, and thanks for that extra information. Now, when we first reached out to you, we had seen an article that you wrote. I think it was a peer-written article, I
Mhm.
believe,
Yep.
and it was very interesting, and it really addressed an issue that I've talked about in the past on this podcast and elsewhere, and that relates to the lady beetles that are oftentimes harvested and we purchase with the intention of using them as a biological control or natural control, however you want to call it, for the pests in our garden, deeming those lady beetles to be our friends. We're declaring war on the pest using the lady beetles for that. But, there's issues there that we've talked about in the past, but you have such a great perspective on it. You've been heavily involved in this research and information. So setting you up with that, can you just give us the backstory on how this article came about and your findings and things that you would like to talk about that you addressed there, but now with me and our listeners?
Sure. So I think one thing is that I think a lot of us who are gardeners have seen ladybird beetles or ladybugs. There's a lot of different terms.
Right.
Ladybug.
Yeah.
And so I generally just call them ladybugs, but I know that in the UK, for example, people often more call them, ladybird beetles. But
Yeah.
so ladybugs is a family of insect. The technical name is Coccinellidae. That's not important, but it's like the grouping is actually a scientific grouping, right? So it's one group of insects, but there's many different kinds of ladybug. And so part of what I was trying to talk about in this piece was that there are some ladybugs that it's really easy to kind of identify as being quote unquote good. And I wanted to really show how there's another set of ladybugs, still ladybugs, that we often much more easily label as quote unquote bad, even though these ladybugs oftentimes are doing the exact same things for us.
Yeah.
And so there's a couple of things I think, some of which are just really practical for thinking about what does it mean as a gardener to buy ladybugs and why you might not want to do it. And some are much more philosophical about how maybe we can take a step back and think about why is it that we are invested in calling some insects good and some insects bad.
Right.
And so I think the practical pieces are, as gardeners, when we have insects in our garden that are eating the plants that we want, that can feel really personal, right? So it's attacking my garden. And so one of the things in this piece too was trying to show and help us reflect on, there's a lot of violent militarized language, right? Like this
Yeah.
insect is attacking my plants, right? That it really feels like, especially, if you like me have a garden at your house, or if you feel really invested in caring for your plants, or you really want that tomato, right? Or whatever it is you're growing, there are insects, right? That eat plants, right? Or are going to eat the fruit that you want to eat. And so it's easy for us to just think we're now in competition with those insects or with those pests. This summer was the first summer that we had a full ripe tomato stolen off of a plant by something, right? And I get that hurts, right? And so I think that one thing is to remember that they want to eat that plant and we want to eat that plant. We actually have something in common, right? It doesn't necessarily make us enemies, but it's easy when you're gardening to be focused on, there's these things that I want out of my garden, and this insect pest is in the way. And now I will point out again, I think this is really, it depends on why you're gardening. So for example, I mentioned I get a lot of joy out of gardening. I enjoy it's much more beautiful and delicious to grow vegetables and flowers than it is for me to grow grass in my front yard, right? Because I can do that.
Yeah.
But if I was growing those plants for like food security, for subsistence, there'd be a different set of things to think about, right? So many of us are growing vegetables or plants, and we're doing it in addition to having other food sources, for example, right? And so that does change what we can think about in terms of thinking about what kinds of risk we're willing to tolerate. So for example, if aphids are eating my brassicas, maybe I can tolerate a lot of aphids on my plants because I don't need those as a food source. I enjoy them, delicious. But if my little garden crop fails at the end of the day, I would be sad, but I would not be food insecure. And so I understand that there are people making really different decisions about that. And so I think part of that is acknowledging that there's not one answer for everyone, because everyone is gardening for different reasons. And so a part of why people are gardening is financial and is to grow food for them in a way that's contributing to their food security. You may not be comfortable with aphids or anything else eating your plants in that way. So there is a parallel to more commercial growing where we think about, the economic threshold, it's called. So it's this wonky term that basically means we calculate how many insects could be on a plant before we know that damage would be caused to the resulting crop. And so most of the time, those are really only calculated for commercial farm scale crops. But the idea is that if you were going to do some sort of pest intervention, whether or not that's adding a biological control agent, whether or not that would be spraying something, you want to do that based on evidence, right? On numbers that we have about, number one, if you actually wait until pest levels get too high, you may not actually be able to prevent the damage. So anyway, the point being that at a commercial crop growing level, there are models of basically, here's what you would look for when you're going around and looking at the pests in your garden. And we don't necessarily have those same numbers for gardeners, right? Because again, everyone's tolerance for insect damage could be a little different, especially if you're growing things ornamentally, right? So for example, if the damage is aesthetic, you need to think about, do I care about that aesthetic damage, right? And that's a really personal decision, right? So if it's not actually going to damage the resulting fruit, or it's only going to damage it aesthetically, I personally might be willing to tolerate a lot more risk than other people. So I think, again, those are some conversations and things to think about. But when it comes to thinking about those insect pests in our garden, the reason that people often like ladybugs is that they're going to eat those things like aphids. And ladybugs are what's known as generalist predators. That's another wonky term from entomology. What it basically means is that they eat a lot of different things. And that's one of the reasons they are so successful as predators. Is that means that if they eat all your aphids, then they can go on to moving and eating something else that's around. So this is what enables them as they're able to move through the landscape, follow food sources. And so that can be really helpful. So sometimes people who don't want to apply pesticides to their garden think, okay, well, I don't want to apply a pesticide, organic or not. I would rather harness the power of ladybugs to eat those things that are eating the plants in my garden. And that's great. One of the challenges about buying them, number one is what I just said about, are you putting them in based on a threshold that we know is actually going to cause damage, right? So for example, if you see one aphid on your plant, it's likely not going to cause, resulting damage that you need to be concerned about. And so it's important to remember that. It's important to have a risk tolerance that is above zero, right? Because lots of things are out there feeding on plants, right?
Yeah.
But that if you want to actually use biological agents, there's different approaches to biological control. So purchasing an agent and putting it in your garden is one approach to biological control. It can be known as augmentive. So the idea being that you're augmenting the biological control that could be in your garden by adding something. And that's the idea. And so in an ideal world, what would happen is you buy the ladybugs, you release them directly into your garden. They eat all the things that you don't like, problem solved, right? That's the ideal. But we know a lot of things now about that is unlikely to happen. And this is what I mean by there. So there are some pragmatic reasons why, even philosophically, you're not on board with rethinking all insects, that you may not want to do this. And so one of which is that it's very unlikely they're going to stay in your garden. So we have a lot of evidence that when you release a beneficial insect, they may actually immediately disperse somewhere else. There are other studies that shown that if you kind of look hour after hour, that most of them tend to leave after 2 days. So it's not a long-term pest solution. And then again, the timing is really important. And so if you wait until you have a really big pest outbreak, you might actually be applying them too late to prevent the damage. That timing can be sensitive and really tricky to get right. And so it might mean that you're not making the best use of your resources to pay money to buy this beneficial insect that is not going to stay or didn't end up preventing the damage. And then the other is to think about the fact that a lot of beneficial insects, some of them can be reared in captivity, meaning they can be grown in like a scientific lab and then you're ordering them from a lab. But it tends to be that the particular ladybug that I wrote about, which is Hippodamia convergens, the convergent ladybug, is generally harvested from the wild. And so what this means is that it's sort of like a fishery, right? So instead of going and catching a fish, this is a ladybug. It's a wild animal and it's being harvested from the wild. And so there's concern that we're actually potentially damaging, again, in practice, think of it like a ladybug fishery, where we want to know if we're actually taking too many of those beneficial insects. So it's a service that we're kind of getting from the natural world. And the concern is that if it's not a farmed animal where we're, investing in the resources, but we're harvesting out of the wild, there's concern that we might actually be depleting them in their home ecosystem. And because it's not regulated like a commercial fishery, we don't really know, for example, how many are out there and how many have been taken. So for example, if I wanted to go harvest deer in New York State, I have to go through various regulations. I need a permit there. If I want to go fishing, there's a catch limit. There are size limits.
Yeah.
One of the concerns is about, is that same kind of approach going to be in place to protect things like beneficial insects? So there was some concern in recent years that we just don't know. And there have been some, I would say, more anecdoted in recent years, in part, again, due to changing conditions, that there may actually be declining beneficial insects on the West Coast. So a lot of where these convergent ladybugs are harvested is out in California. And so, especially as someone on the East Coast, if I'm purchasing these organisms from the West Coast and then applying them here, what am I doing ecologically? And so that's one of my concerns, right? Is thinking about, what does this mean both for the ecosystem that I'm putting these into, my tiny ecosystem of my home garden, and then the ecosystem that I've removed these from. And so I think sometimes it's important to remember that when we're gardening, we're often just thinking about our little garden, right? But really, at the end of the day, everything is connected. And so it's kind of zooming back out to remember that if we remove these organisms, especially if lots and lots of people are doing this, then we might be having an effect at a much larger scale than we realize by our collective action. There are other ways, though, to think about ladybugs. And so part of what I was trying to do in this piece was contrast the language about these particular ladybugs with how we often villainize other ladybugs that are actually much more likely to be around us in our gardens and will get you the same pest control. So the other particular ladybug that I was writing about is known as the Harlequin ladybug. It has a lot of other names too, but one of the things that we can talk about is that, especially for the field that I come from, entomology, which is a study of insects, there's been a push to change how we refer to insects. So the Harlequin ladybug is one of what's known as common names, as in it's not the like Latin scientific name in the same way that we would say the convergent ladybug is a common name. But there's a project of professional insect scientists that's called the Better Common Names Project that is on purpose trying to acknowledge that a lot of times the insects that we are villainizing, we are putting the country or continent of origin in the name. And this is part of a long and often bad history of conflating people and animals from other places in a way that can be dehumanizing to people and is often xenophobic. So there's another common name for the Harlequin ladybug that's the multicolored Asian ladybug.
Right.
And I don't know for sure that that's on the list of common names that may change, but I just mentioned that because I'm making an intentional choice not to use that common name because there were some really great pieces actually even during COVID, right, written about growing violence on Asian Americans here and how people were referring to the COVID virus. But it's really common in the field of entomology and also with invasive plants, for example.
Yeah.
Talk about wildlife from other places in ways that can be demonizing. And then if we actually look to, for example, the history of science, there are documented cases where people from other places and immigrants were conflated with insects from those places in ways that villainize both people and insects.
Right.
And so on purpose was trying to use this example of this particular ladybug to show that the Harlequin ladybug is not quote unquote of here as in America. Okay. But that whole conversation about where things are quote unquote from, number one, is also really complicated and philosophical because you have to pick a reference point. What does it mean for wildlife to be from a place? You actually have to set a year that you mean because the world is always changing, right? That's what we're talking about. Right. And the other is to remember that the term native, right? So if we're saying, well, the convergent ladybug is native, right? The term native is used in a bunch of different ways, but often what it means is we're talking about the boundaries of a country. So for example, if different federal agencies in the US are concerned about, insects or plants coming in from other places, because what if they spread? They're using the boundaries of our country to think about, that being an important way to think about what's coming in accidentally, right? Or we don't want people to bring something in that's beautiful and, it inadvertently spreads everywhere because that's happened before. So I think one thing for us to remember, and in part because lots of gardeners care about quote unquote native plants too, is that the concept of nativity for plants and insects is actually very recent. And so it was really developed by botanists in England in the 1800s. And then invasion biology as a field wasn't really created and sort of formalized until about 30 years ago. But so even when the idea was started, it was really botanists thinking about what is flora that is of Britain, right? So again, it started as a national identity. And then what is alien, quote unquote, and not from here. So I think it's important for us to remember that starting point because in practice, there are actually lots of ladybugs, both where I am, where you are, all across our country that are not quote unquote from here. And we get a lot of benefits from them. So there was a great study done a little while ago from, it's been several years ago now, from Cornell University that looked at what are the most common ladybugs here in New York State. And many of them are not quote unquote from here, right? If you're thinking about were they here, let's say 300 years ago. But many of them are naturalized. And interestingly, we would not consider them to be quote unquote invasive, as in meaning that they're bad, right? So one of the things I'm trying to reflect on in this piece is these labels that we give insects and which ones we decide get to be good and bad, right? Those are human decisions, and we can be reflective about them. We can change them. We can think critically about why is it that we are willing to spend money on a native ladybug, but why wouldn't we just promote the ladybugs that are already around us that can get us that pest control? And so part of this is thinking about the fact that oftentimes as gardeners, we're being given messages, right? I'm not saying that this is people doing this intentionally necessarily, but that native plants and native insects means good. And often the implication is that the reverse must be true, that if it isn't, that it must be bad.
Right.
Simply not true. So we get lots of benefits from insects and plants that are not considered to be native, as in they are not originally from here. And as gardeners, right, we're growing lots of things that likely are not quote unquote from here, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that it's useful for us in particular to remember that. And then it can be important to then reflect on that's part of why some of those insects have a close relationship with those plants, right? So a classic example of this is thinking about honeybees, right? So honeybees are not quote unquote from here, right?
Right.
But they're really well adapted to pollinate lots of plants that are from the same part of the world that they are, which is why they make great pollinators of apple trees, right? But then there's lots of evidence that if we have too many honeybees, it can actually have a negative impact on native bees and other native pollinators in our area. And so I think that being a gardener, it's an important way for us to think about that we can have an impact and to remember that there's lots of wildlife out there that might be moving into or through our garden. And can we be a good steward of that wildlife, right? So with ladybugs that are showing up in our garden, they may not be the ones that we necessarily wanted there the most, but what are we going to do about that, right? And so I think that on one hand, this can present a lot of opportunities. So if you're someone who's really cares about promoting native ladybugs and native insects, one thing to just start learning about is what they look like. So ladybugs look a lot of different things. And I think one of the challenges of talking about this is that a lot of times we don't learn a lot or not taught a lot about insects. And luckily, ladybugs have distinctive coloration and marking patterns. And so in terms of being insects to learn more about, they're a little bit easier to tell apart. And that's a great thing, right? So it presents an opportunity to learn about and start paying attention to what is showing up to your garden. And so again, if we are okay with that, it becomes a way to use what's known as conservation biological control, which means that we're interested in promoting and attracting ladybugs to our gardens that are already in the landscape. And so, for example, for me then in New York State, that might mean that not all of those ladybugs that are in the area around me that might show up to my garden are going to be quote unquote native. And personally, I'm okay with that because if what I'm concerned about is natural pest control, is about not putting chemical pesticides in my garden, then I am getting a benefit from those beneficial insects, right? Beneficial insect means that it's a service to me. And it's providing a service that I'm not mail ordering. So all of those can be really good things. But I think part of why that can be controversial is it requires then thinking about which things are we interested in promoting, right? And conversations about which insects we're interested in promoting or conserving is really all about human values, right? So there's no one right answer there. And so those become conversations where science can't solve them. And it's really about thinking about what do we want out of ecosystems? What are we interested in protecting? And so those are really conversations that we have to have in community, right? And policy is actually, right, a result of community conversations in practice. And so, before you ask me kind of how did I start on this, and the story is very silly in practice, but there is this moment that really sticks with me about going to college, being in my first year of college. I was taking a lot of classes about natural resources management. And we were on a field trip to do something in a stream. I don't remember that part of it. But what I remember distinctly is being back at the bus, basically waiting to go back to campus. And other students and I saw a ladybug on the side of the van, and we were like, look, it's so cute. It's this ladybug. And I remember our professor distinctly walking up to us, smashing it with his open hand, saying that's invasive, and walking away. And it was really fascinating because at the time I had never thought of ladybugs as having that particular label. And there are many people that view the Harlequin ladybug, which it probably was in retrospect, was that particular ladybug, as invasive, as problems. And there are just a lot of ways to view ladybugs. And part of it depends on where they are. And so the other reason that the Harlequin ladybug is often known to people or often viewed as a pest is because even though it can get you this great pest control benefit in your garden, it's also the one that may be, let's say, aggregating and congregating under your shingles or trying to into your windowsill. I just saw one outside of my office the other day, right on the window. And I was like, oh yeah, fall is starting. Here come the ladybugs trying to get inside of, the heater in my office. And that might be a frustrating behavior. I think as someone who studies insects, I try to kind of zoom back out and think about the fact that there are a small number of people for whom ladybugs can present an allergy. It is true that ladybugs can bite you. One thing to remember is that that's not only true of Harlequin ladybugs. So that is true of all ladybugs. All ladybugs could bite you. All ladybugs you could potentially have an allergy to. And so again, I think it's important to remember that a lot of times the commonalities that are shared between the ones we deem good and the ones we deem bad, a lot of times they actually have the same properties. It's just that we've thought about this set as being really good, and we've sometimes kind of villainized this other set. There are insects that can transmit diseases, or there are insects that can be a public health risk. Ladybugs are not in that category, but there are people who can have, for example, a skin reaction to them if they were bitten by them. That's absolutely true. I just think it's important to remember that that's not only true of that one species. So that could be true, of any ladybug that you encounter. You might be more likely to encounter a Harlequin ladybug by the fact that it may be trying to move indoors in the winter, depending on where you live.
Well, I see a lot of them out in my garden, and like you, I don't have an issue with it. But one of the reasons, maybe two of the reasons that they get a bad rap is they have the reputation of being potentially predatory on other lady beetles versus some of the other lady beetles that we deem friendlier.
Yeah. And I will say that there are multiple ladybugs that are omnivorous, right? And there are some ladybugs that are also considered crop pests, right? So I live near a wine growing area, right? And so certainly out in California, right? Ladybugs, if they end up in grapes, can be considered a pest in vineyard environments or of wine. So I think, again, it's a reminder that it really depends on what you're growing. And if a pest is also eating that thing, right, then they may be a pest to you, right? So it sort of depends on what it's doing. And so I think that's a good reminder that these are not binary categories. It sort of all depends, right? So it might depend on, you and I might be growing totally different things or have different other beneficials in our garden that we're concerned about. But that, I would say, is true of a lot of different generalist predators, right? So yes, generalist predators means they eat lots of different things. And so ladybugs are omnivorous, right? So they are eating soft-bodied, let's say aphids, for example, which, yes, means they eat other insects. So, right, if you're concerned that they're also going to eat something else that you want to promote, that can be a problem. Now, I will say, though, that thinking more broadly about biological control and the history of biological control, the reason we like generalist predators is that the flip side of generalist predators is often like a really host-specific, let's say, parasitoid. Or so the idea being that something that is only going to eat one very specific food source. And there's a long history in the US of trying to really harness that power, right? If we have a crop pest, we want to find something that only targets that one insect. And there's a lot of misadventures of it going basically very poorly, of it not working when we introduce new environments. But one of the challenges of those stabilizing, right, being around long term, is that if that population of whatever they're eating crashes, they need another food source or they won't persist in the environment. And so it's meant that longer term, generalist predators tend to be more effective in a lot of cases because they can eat multiple things, right? And
Hmm.
so it is just one of the trade-offs of the fact that they are really good predators is, yes, part of what makes them really effective predators able to do pest control in the landscape is that they can eat multiple things, right? So I would say that there's no silver bullet, right, in that case. And so that is one of the reasons too that I think it's worth thinking about biocontrol in this framework generally and with ladybugs. Was part of my goal writing the article was that often we like to think about biological control as being the opposite of chemical pest control.
Hmm.
But I think that when we try to buy something and release it, we're actually using the same framework as when we just buy a spray and try to use a spray, right?
Hmm.
And so it's not to say that either one of those has to be good or bad, but I
Hmm.
think it's an important reminder that it's not the opposite. It's very much an extension of that same idea. And so
Wow.
I think that it's important for us to remember that ladybugs are also not silver bullets. And see, notice even silver bullet, right, is a military kind of very aggressive, but it's for us to remember that, yes, ladybugs can be really effective predators, but it is not a one and done solution, right? So it's part of a set of management tools of how we're managing pests in our garden. And
Yeah.
so we shouldn't really look to anything as a silver bullet per se. And when something is a silver bullet, there may be unintended consequences, right? So I think about that there are some chemicals that are biocides, right? Meaning they will literally, kill everything. And it's like, I guess that's a silver bullet, but that would not be great for your
Mm-mm.
garden either, right? So
Right.
there's always this trade-off between targeted interventions and ones that are going to be broader. And so I think that we just need to remember that ladybugs fit more into that idea of it is not one and done. And then certainly, even if it feels like buying and releasing ladybugs is one and done here locally in my little garden, right? To remember that connection back to a real ecosystem somewhere
Right.
else.
The other thing about the Harlequin lady beetle is I rarely hear it referred to by that term versus the much more common reference to Asian lady beetle. And it definitely has a bad rap, whatever you call it. But that's the term I hear 99% of the time. And the fear is from the gardeners who really have a dislike for it is that they're displacing the native lady beetles. But without regard to the fact that there are other omnivores out there doing the same thing. And it's not just the Asian lady beetles, but they're getting a really bad rap because of that reason. And the reason you mentioned earlier is that they share our homes in the wintertime.
Yeah. I mean, in the terms of the displacement thing, I will say that the science on this is not that clear. So
Right.
I figured this was coming and I made sure to look this up so we could talk about it. So there was a review that was done back in 2007 of what ladybugs are in the US and Canada and which different ones have been introduced. And so the best research that exists to date, from entomologists, was that there have been 179 ladybug species introduced in the US and Canada, and 27 of those have become established. And then some of that same data found there was no difference in the number of ladybugs overall when you're comparing before and after the Harlequin ladybug becoming established. So
Mm.
I think that anytime we're talking about new life in an ecosystem and the impacts it might have, those are definitely important questions. And I think that the best thing we can do is say, what is the evidence that we have about that? So my concern with that always is, what is the evidence that we have? And there is not consensus evidence that it is, like, for example, a one-to-one displacement.
Right.
And then I think the other thing that's important for us to remember as gardeners is that gardens are, if I can say this, not natural, right? There's nothing natural about my lawn. There's nothing natural about my garden either, right? And
Yeah.
so I think that sometimes fear mongering about what's natural or what should be can we need to remember that we're part of that conversation, right? So the reason that the plants in my garden are not of here is that I planted them there, right? And so
Right.
what's showing up and what isn't showing up is about what all of us are doing with the choices that we're making about what we're choosing to promote and not in the world around us. And
Mm.
there's a scholar that I really want to mention because it's a really useful framework and their work is really excellent. Dr. Jennifer Berneda Grenz,
Mhm.
who's an indigenous scientist who studies invasive plants. And they have a framework that they refer to as relationally preferred species. And I think this is really important because they're making multiple points in their work on this. One of which is everyone since the dawn of time has been preferring some species over others, right? Is managing resources and what you select for. And this paradigm is also in their work trying to push back on these ideas about what is supposedly belonging here or not, to point out that oftentimes when we talk about what ladybugs or other life forms are quote unquote of here or considered native, that it tends to be using a baseline that ignores and erases indigenous management of ecosystems, right?
Mm.
Indigenous management of ecosystems has gone on for millennia. And so relationally preferred species can refer to all different ways that people manage for resources that may not be farming, right? So thinking about how people manage fisheries, thinking about how people have done burning patterns or cultivated different fruit and nut trees, right? There are millennia of example of indigenous communities preferring some species over others, right? This is not new in that sense. And so remembering that there's a long history of this, but also that can help take us out of this good and bad binary that is a choice to use that we don't need to use, right?
Mm.
So it's a way I think that we can think about it's okay to have preferences. It's okay to say, I want to grow this thing here and I really want to eat this and I don't eat these other things. And that's actually what we're doing by gardening, right? Is
Mm.
we're promoting, for example, some plants over others. And when we're managing our garden, we are likely preferring some insects over others, right? We're
Yeah.
preferring ones that don't eat the plants that we want to eat generally. So I think it's really important to go to other thinkers who are helping us think past this good and bad binary. And I mentioned before, there were some good examples of this during even the beginning of COVID. So I wanted to find, you can edit this part out, but I wanted to find their name just so I did not forget it. But yeah, Jenny Liu wrote for High Country News at the beginning of the pandemic. I wrote this really excellent article that was called Am I an Invasive Species? And they wrote about being an Asian person who was feeling vilified in part due to all of the anti-Asian and anti-Asian American violence, but also that this was a time in which there was a lot of fear mongering about murder hornets, if you remember this a
Yeah.
couple months ago.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Also, a common name that was being used at the time to include its point of origin, right? So again, this is, I would say, I'm using the term mortar hornet then on purpose, right, to not include that. But
Right.
one of the, again, reasons to consider the harm that comes from this is that there are people all over the country who were assuming that any hornet they saw was a murder hornet, right? And
Mm.
so even if you're someone who thinks that you're trying to promote conservation, there was harm done to native wasps and hornets that live
Yeah.
here that people might think they actually want to promote because they were buying into this fear mongering that can be very xenophobic, but also that oftentimes people don't have the full information to make those decisions and manage the ecosystem. So
Right.
there were different explainers that had to be put out about, hey, if you think you saw a murder hornet, number one, unless you were basically in Washington state, no, you didn't. To remember that this kind of generating fear-mongering buzz can lead to misinformation. And so I think that
Yeah.
oftentimes as gardeners, we may not be aware that we are actually targets of misinformation. And so, you know, you're mentioning about the different terms that are used for the Harlequin ladybug, but one of the things that really struck me, and honestly, it saddened me in this research, was that there are a lot of different terms, right? Not just used for ladybugs, but how they're referred to. And so some people and agencies do refer to the Harlequin ladybug as invasive and really view it, right, as this is a displacement issue. Other scientists and entomologists will refer to it as naturalized, meaning, right, it's here now, it's established, we do get benefits from it. Another term for that is adventive, which means, again, that it's another scientific term, but it basically means that it's here now. It wasn't from here, but there are wild populations of it. And in our case, we're getting a benefit from it. So maybe that's one way to think about it. But one of the things I noticed was that some state cooperative extensions were actually saying, well, there are real ladybugs, but the Harlequin ladybug is not the real ladybug. And
Mm.
that's actually misinformation. That is
Hmm.
misinforming people because, like we started talking about, ladybugs is a taxonomic group. It's a family of beetles. And so just because we don't like one of them or some of them doesn't mean you get to say these are the real ones and these aren't. That's not actually true. But I will say again that there's a lot of information, especially on social media, that is for people who like plants or people who like gardening. And I think it's important to remember that not all of it is accurate, but also that sometimes even scientists can be agents of that kind of misinformation. So
Mm.
that can create challenges, especially for people who study and want to promote conservation of insects, to having conversations with people. Because, like you said, there's a lot of information that people say, well, I heard this about it, I heard this about it. And now that we're getting to be near the fall, I'm sure people will be hearing again about Harlequin ladybugs and what they might be doing. And that's why I think it's actually good to talk about this before people might see them, to remember that, yes, it might be a nuisance and it's totally okay to not want them in your house, but that doesn't mean that they're going to be a health problem. It doesn't mean you need to be scared of them. And so I think that it's important to remember to share accurate, not fear-based information about managing any kind of insect, right? And so that also includes ladybugs and when we're thinking about our garden and our homes too.
Yeah. This is such an enlightening conversation. I love it so much. And I guess there's just two things I want to just kind of wrap up on. And one is to, you talked about, well, we began this conversation when we got into the lady beetle discussion, bringing in the ones from the Sierra Nevadas, purchasing them versus promoting the ones that are already there. As an entomologist, as a gardener, Kaitlyn, give us your 2 cents on what we can do to promote those ones that are already there, or to bring in more of the ones that would naturally come to our gardens.
Sure. So I think there's things you can do directly and indirectly. And part of the reason I want to say that is people may think, well, if I don't have a lot of land or I don't have a big garden, or maybe I only have a container garden, right? That doesn't mean that you don't have a role that to play in beneficial insect conservation if you want it. So I think it's really important to remember that there's things that everyone can do. So it's even as simple as just general energy conservation and resource conservation, right? When you are saving energy and you are wasting less water, you are broadly contributing to the conservation of resources and mitigating climate change. And all of that is going to help all beneficial insects, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's really important to remember that there are steps that you can take that are far outside of directly managing your garden that are going to be really important for beneficial insects. And I think that those are the hardest ones maybe sometimes to talk through because they're
Yeah.
the longest term ones. But those are things that we can really build collective action at scale. And part of why they're important to me is that so much of talking about gardening might assume that you have to have access to land, and who has access to land is not equal, right? And there's, especially in the US, a history of indigenous displacement, of redlining and segregated communities that really affects who might have a home or a home garden or access to space. There's enormous housing crises, for example, all over our country. And so it's really important to remember that you do not need to have land or own land or anything like that to be an agent of conservation, to do things for insects and also for wildlife. And so some of that is just everything that you do to reduce your ecological footprint, buying things secondhand, just reducing the amount of stuff you're buying new generally. All of that is actually a way to promote the health of
Yeah.
beneficial insects and ecosystems. And so
Yeah.
I think that might feel a lot less satisfying maybe than just saying if we only bought the right product, right?
Yeah.
Because that's a big and hard thing to do. But all of that stuff is actually going to help all of us as people and communities, and also actually all those insect communities. I do think part of it is just what we talked about, which is learning more about what's around you. That way we can appreciate it, but also that we can identify it so that we know what's there,
Yeah.
that you're better than informed to have conversations yourself and with other people so that it's not fear-based, misinformation about what may or may not be out there. That you'll know for yourself by being able to know, oh, these are the things that are visiting my garden, right? And so there are lots of great resources and places that are more common and easily accessible now, like iNaturalist.
Yeah.
People can get help identifying insects and get some more verification that they might be looking at something again, because it can be tricky on the open internet to just know that you're getting the right information, but to do it in a way that's vetted. There are lots of great resources from places like Cooperative Extension, including, which is in every state, and also that some cooperative extensions will also have identifying services where for a small fee, if there's something you really want identified, that you can
Mm-hmm.
actually pay someone to do that work for you. So if you are really concerned about something, right, you can make sure that you have the right information. And so those are pieces that, again, don't require you buy anything necessarily. So helping just conserve generally, buying less stuff generally, learning more about the world around you. Those are things that all of us can do that I think are really exciting that can help promote ladybugs that we're interested in conserving. And then
But
in terms of things that are just more directly in your garden, right? It's thinking about what is it that you want to help promote and what do they need throughout their whole life cycle. So,
mm-hmm.
for example, are you like one of the general things that we say if you want to promote pollinators year round is just do you have flowering resources? Oftentimes, the things that can help beneficial insects have shelter in the winter means being a lazier gardener in the sense of leaving leaf litter and other things,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
it might actually mean less work for you. And then you get the benefit of knowing that you're helping create habitat over winter for things that you want to promote.
Yeah. I love both of your answers. This part two of your answer, I was expecting to hear, but you even embellished on that in important ways with the it's okay to be a lazy gardener in the fall because we're actually helping provide those habitats for overwintering.
I think it's okay to be a lazy gardener year round. And one of the things really, like sometimes I
Yeah.
have plants that go to flower and I'm like, okay, well, that
Yeah.
bolted, but
Yeah.
now it's a resource, right? And
Yeah.
then I get
Me
to
too.
see everything that visits that arugula or that
Yeah.
radish that flowered. And so I think that I think being a lazy gardener is underrated. I'm here to promote that.
That's funny you say that as a having my garden videoed and on TV a lot for my show. I feel the need to explain why I've let these flowers bolt. My brassicas are blooming in May and June, and like, why did he let that happen? And it's because they're one of the few flowers in bloom
Mhm.
for the pollinators to visit when they don't have any other options to do. And that wasn't necessarily being lazy, although that's the term we're using. It's being intentional.
Oh,
And
right.
yeah, no, and either way, I know what you mean by that, but that's fine. But what I wanted to also say is thank you for the first part of your answer because that is so broad reaching. And we hear the term climate change all the time now, and it's becoming like sustainability was. It's just a term that just doesn't seem to have the teeth in it used to have, but it's still no less important. But for you to provide that application as a gardener as to why, as if we needed one more reason to think about what we can do to minimize climate change, is that, hey, if you want to benefit those beneficial insects or the ones that we deem to be that in our garden, think more about conservation and, less resource use and things like that. So that was an angle I didn't see coming, but I'm so glad that you went there. Thank you.
Oh yeah, well, thank you. And I think again, it's just important to me because, like you mentioned, if people are starting out gardening, or gardening means all kinds of things, right? Like you don't have to have space outside or own your land to be a gardener. And I think probably both you and I want as many people who want to embrace being a gardener to do that, right? And feel empowered to do that. And so I think again that as a former community gardener where it's not quote unquote my land, but I'm helping cultivate a garden, there are so many things that I can do off site that are going to help the insects and the
Yeah.
services that I want to promote, that it doesn't need to happen on site and does not require ownership. And I think that's just so important because a lot of times when we talk about stewardship, the default assumptions assume that you have to do something in your yard. And that can give the impression that the more yard or the more garden you have, the more moral you're being by doing the good thing there. I think it's really important for us to remember that less is more and more is more too, right? So I think that the absence of buying something or having something can be just as powerful, right? And so I think it's just really important for us to own that and to think about all those indirect things. Right? Like I'm talking to you in a secondhand t-shirt, right? So reducing the amount of resources, right, that's going into that is also a way. And I think that probably a lot of the people that we're thinking about are already taking those steps and they just haven't thought about how that is actually helping promote beneficial insects. You're probably already doing things that are beneficial.
Uh-huh.
for ladybugs and other insects. And so I
Mm,
think it's owning that. Like you said, it's not lazy, it's intentional.
yeah. The term we've always heard about being good stewards is the reduce, reuse, recycle, those three words. But the one that hit me the most when I learned about it was there's a fourth word that starts with R, and it's refuse. And that's what you should put on the front end of all of those things is when you go to the grocery store, refuse the plastic bag, maybe bring, your own thing, or refuse buying whatever. Just finding those reasons why you don't need it to begin with, or you can do without it and still accomplish what it is that you need to do. So that's the fourth big R in that concept. The last thing, Caitlin, I just wanted to come back to because I loved you touched on it briefly, and that was correct the terminology because I don't think I got it exactly right, but it's the push out there in the professional industry to provide better common names.
Yes.
I just love that so much. Okay, you're holding that up. Tell us
Yes.
more about that. Where do we learn more?
Well, so I want to say first that I am not sure when initially this started so the Entomology Society of America is the professional group of scientists that studies insects, and their particular project is called the Better Common Names Project. So this started with a group called more so Bird Names for Birds, which is actually the group of bird scientists that are recognizing that there are different common names of birds that often were to celebrate, they were named after a specific person, right? And so when you name an animal after a person, that's seen as a great honor. And so they're revisiting, okay, there's all these bird names that are named after people that maybe we don't want to honor and promote. Let's rethink that. And so what they're focused on is changing all of those bird names. Their goal as a group to be traits of the bird, to say, let's not name them after people at all. There's lots of reasons why that's not an inclusive practice generally. So insects, in many ways, the same thing. If someone finds a new insect, they generally get the naming rights to the scientific
Mhm.
name.
Right.
And so now there's these formal committees, though, that are revisiting the fact that there are a lot of insects in particular, like we were talking about, that especially if they're not quote unquote of here, there's a geographic reference in the name that may be unnecessary, or that there are terms that are what we would now consider to be slurs, or maybe even were slurs at the time in the common name. So
Mhm.
there are some insects that have actually already been renamed. And so, for example, there is a spongy moth that was now one of the first name changes. And so the goal of this committee in terms of the Entomology Society is that this is, scientists working with each other on this practice. So anyone can read about this. And they have working groups that are trying to solicit feedback. But there's also a great post I can send you of a scientist who named an ant something, and then they realized later that it was a insensitive term, and they went through the process of trying to get the name changed. And so I think that those are things that, again, maybe people didn't think about the intent or didn't think about the intent at the time, but it's that separation of intent and impact, right? So
Mhm.
recognizing that there have been ways that fields have contributed to referring to groups, especially that are maybe from another place, as being harmful or dangerous. And that can be really, really harmful, especially for people. And so,
Yeah.
again, the entomology group even cites some examples of articles showing those connections of where that's happened. Because
Wow.
I will say that even sometimes scientists push back and say, what's the big deal? It's just a word. I think it's really important to say we do actually have examples of how that conflation happens and how it's happened in the past, that we can show that there's harm there and that
Hmm.
rhetoric can be harmful. And so it's not as simple as saying it's just a word, it's a choice. And when we villainize things that are not from here, then it's a choice then to be always emphasizing the quote unquote not of here part of that. So I think, again, to remember that there's lots of things that are from here that we don't like, right? So that it's not as simple, and it's sort of a cop out sometimes to just make being of a different place to be a shorthand for bad, right? So,
Right.
a lot of the field work I do in the summer is out and about with different plants that all of us would consider to be weeds, or that are considered to be not fun. Like you're out and there's poison ivy out, right? Like that's a great example of a relationally non-preferred species for sure, right? That people are not
Yeah.
interested in promoting that. but it has nothing to do with where it's quote unquote from.
Good example. Wow. Such great information. I thank you so much for all of this. And you just clearly live and breathe this. You are very enthusiastic about sharing this information, and your knowledge is impressive, and your ability to communicate it even more so. So
Oh,
thank
that's
you.
so kind of you.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for that. And I hope we were able to do another conversation. I'm certainly open to it if you are, because I know you have a lot more to say, and I think our audience would love to hear it. So let's have a date to be determined in the not too distant future if you're open to it
I
for
would love
another
that. Sure.
conversation.
Yeah. Thank you. It's been a pleasure. And yeah, I think that I mentioned you at the start that my job now as an environmental studies professor is to help get students who are becoming scientists, right, and engineers to think about these human pieces. And that
Mhm.
is such a joy. We're getting ready to start the new school year here. And that to me is the most fun. I get to work with a lot of environmental science students, right? And they want to save the world. And so
Mm.
part of my goal is to say to them, what we think we want to do is really all of us bringing all of our human values and ideas and goals to that. And so we just need to take a step back and think about it. And that will help us be more intentional as we go out and try to do these good things in the world around us.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that. I loved Caitlin's enthusiasm and her passion for the topics we discussed today. She's obviously very well versed on these topics, and it's easy to see that she's given great thought to everything that we talked about today. Now, I have a request for you today and an announcement that you might be interested in learning more about. First, my request for your feedback. We've been posting all of our podcast episodes as YouTube videos for about 7 months now. That's still a relatively short time to find our groove on style and what to include and what to leave out from the YouTube version versus the audio version. But what's your style preference for watching this? Do you prefer the side-by-side view with the guest and me always present on the screen at the same time? Or do you prefer isolating whoever's speaking at the time? It's a little thing, but you might have a preference, and I'd love to know. Secondly, what's missing that you'd like to see, or what would you prefer that we leave off from these videos? But any thoughts are welcome. We'd love to grow this side of the podcast, so let us know and leave a comment, and thanks in advance for doing that. Now, I have a recent video that's getting a lot of interest that was just posted about a week ago at the time of this recording, and it's related to my big new raised bed garden rebuild project that you might have heard about recently and seen it on social. But this video is a behind the scenes story of how this project started, from literally demolishing the existing raised bed garden to a total rebuild and replacement of the new beds, and it's very different from the original ones. We take you through the steps of making the new beds and the hurdles along the way. And the bonus is we have a free download of the plans that you can input your own information that will calculate the cost of what you want to build, assuming typically what we would build, and it'll tell you everything that you'll need, from the size of all the lumber, the quantity of the various screws, and even how much soil that you'll need to fill the number of beds that you're creating. And a huge shout out to my friend David Park for creating this incredible resource, which is free. And to get it, just head over to the website, joegardner.com/raisedbedplans, no spaces. Again, that's joegardner.com/raisedbedplans. So that's going to do it for today. Thank you, as always, to Amy Prentice, Brendan O'Reilly, and Christine LaFond for their hard work every week getting these podcasts ready. And thank you for joining me today. My goal for every episode is to help you take the guesswork out of gardening by teaching you the why-do behind the how-to so that you can become a better, smarter, more confident gardener. I'll be back here again next Thursday for another episode of the Joe Gardener Show, and I look forward to having you right back here to join me for that. Until then, have a great week, take care, and I'll see you back here really soon. Thanks for watching.